March 10, 1944. Lyon, France. A cold wind curled through the narrow cobblestone streets as dusk fell across the occupied city. German floodlights swung lazily across the square, slicing the shadows into strips of safety and danger. At the corner, a Gestapo checkpoint stood like a gate into another world. Uniformed men with leather coats, jackboots, and pistols inspecting every passerby. Through this scene moved a woman in a plain beige trench coat. In her hands, she carried a wicker basket, its cloth covering stretched tight over a loaf of bread and a bundle of onions. To the soldiers, she was a nurse from the nearby hospital, her badge pinned discreetly to her coat. She looked ordinary, even fragile, but inside the heel of her right shoe was a secret capable of reshaping the war. Microfilm photographs of German troop movements along the Rhone Valley, destined for London. Her pulse quickened as the queue inched forward. She forced her breathing to slow, forcing her face into an expression of faint fatigue. Just another French woman enduring another evening under the watchful eyes of the occupiers. But every second, the risk mounted. If they searched too closely, if her accent faltered, if her story cracked, the Gestapo would drag her away. Torture, interrogation, execution. It was the price every woman in the resistance carried silently in her bones. The guard barked an order. She stepped forward. The German officer's eyes swept across her, resting on the basket. He tugged at the cloth and frowned at the contents. For an endless heartbeat, he looked at her as though peeling away layers of disguise. Then, without a word, he waved her through. She did not allow herself to breathe until she had turned the corner and vanished into the labyrinth of Lyon's back streets. This scene was not an anomaly. Across occupied Europe, women carried lies and secrets with the same calmness as others carried bread. They were not frontline soldiers with rifles and helmets. They fought in shadows, using deception as their weapon. For the Allies, women like this nurse-turned-courier were the thin, fragile links connecting resistance cells to London, carrying messages, microfilm, and coded instructions past Gestapo checkpoints. Each journey was a gamble, each disguise a shield made of paper and courage. In Britain, the Special Operations Executive, Winston Churchill's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, had realized the unique advantage women provided. Men of fighting age were watched, stopped, and often imprisoned at the slightest suspicion. Women, underestimated by their enemies, could slip through occupied towns with fewer questions. They worked as couriers, nurses, radio operators, and intelligence gatherers. Some hid Allied pilots in barns. Others passed coded messages across factory floors. Each act chipped away at Nazi control, though none could be sure if they would live to see freedom return. The Gestapo, however, was not blind. They knew women played a dangerous role in the underground war. Their files grew thick with names, photographs, and whispered rumors. Orders were issued: capture them, break them, silence them. For women caught with hidden codes or radio transmitters, there was no mercy. The Geneva Convention did not protect spies. They were considered saboteurs, stripped of rights, and subject to execution. Yet, despite the danger, more and more women volunteered for missions behind enemy lines. In cities like Lyon, Paris, and Warsaw, the quiet defiance of women became the invisible veins of resistance. A nurse carried forged papers under her bandages. A schoolteacher passed notes through her students. A factory worker sabotaged ammunition shells bound for the Eastern Front. They disguised courage beneath the ordinary, wearing fear like a second skin. The trench-coated woman in Lyon that night disappeared into history, her identity lost in the thousands of names recorded only in fading archives. But her story mirrors those of countless women who dared to fight in silence. They were not remembered for medals or battlefield victories. They were remembered, if at all, for the whispers of survival, the invisible hand that fed intelligence into Allied command rooms, shaping campaigns far beyond their reach. behind every great military operation. Whether in Normandy, Italy, or the deserts of North Africa, there were scraps of intelligence smuggled under skirts, coded messages tapped in safe houses, or maps hidden in loaves of bread. This was the hidden front, and women stood at its center. The story of female espionage in World War II begins here, in the silence of occupied streets, where every step could be the last, and every lie carried the weight of freedom. Their war was not one of armies clashing in open fields, but of shadows, disguises, and the unyielding courage to shatter Nazi secrets from within. The war had shattered old rules. Across Europe and beyond, women who once lived ordinary lives, teaching school children, caring for families, or filing office papers, were being drawn into the clandestine struggle. By 1940, with France fallen and Britain standing alone, Winston Churchill ordered the creation of the Special Operations Executive, the SOE, tasked to set Europe ablaze. Its recruiters quickly realized that women could pass through occupied towns with less suspicion than men. They blended into marketplaces, hospitals, and train stations, carrying secrets in baskets, handbags, or simply in memory. In quiet drawing rooms and military offices, recruitment began. Some women volunteered after seeing posters calling for service. Others were approached directly, their language skills or local knowledge too valuable to ignore. Many joined not out of ambition, but because of personal loss. Fathers, brothers, or husbands killed in battle, leaving a fire of defiance burning in their hearts. Violette Sabo was one such recruit. Born in Paris but raised in London, she was a young widow when her husband, a French foreign legionnaire, was killed at El Alamein. Still in her early 20s, with a small daughter at home, Violette chose not to retreat into grief. Instead, she stepped forward into the most dangerous path available, telling a recruiter with quiet conviction, "I want to do my part." Others came from backgrounds that seemed far from war. Noor Inayat Khan, daughter of an Indian Sufi mystic and an American mother, was a gifted musician and writer of children's stories. Yet, as the Nazis swept across Europe, she set aside her harp and her manuscripts to serve as a wireless operator for the SOE, the most perilous role in occupied France, where the lifespan of a radio operator was often measured in weeks. Her gentle nature masked a core of steel. Odette Sansom, another unlikely recruit, was a mother of 3 when she volunteered. Her fragile health and quiet demeanor gave no hint of the resilience she would later show under Gestapo torture. When she was first approached, she hesitated. Not for herself, but for her children. Yet the sight of German troops parading through France, the land of her birth, tipped her decision. She joined not out of recklessness, but duty. Before these women could be sent across the Channel, they faced an initiation unlike any other. In remote corners of the Scottish Highlands, hidden behind barbed wire and guarded gates, training camps prepared them for a new identity. Agents of sabotage and deception. The cold wind whipped across heather-covered hills as recruits learned to fire pistols, set explosives, and navigate with only stars and compass. They practiced parachute jumps from low-flying aircraft, tumbling into mud and bracken, bruised but determined. Instructors drilled them mercilessly. Every disguise had to be flawless, every cover story airtight. A misplaced word could cost not only their own life, but the lives of entire resistance networks. They were taught to resist interrogation, to memorize complex codes, and to transmit messages in bursts short enough to avoid German radio detection vans. Nights were spent hunched over wireless sets, fingers trembling as they tapped out Morse code into the dark, knowing that in occupied Europe, the same act could bring the Gestapo to their door. Some faltered. Not every recruit could endure the pressure. One recalled, "They asked if I could kill. I said no, and that was the end of me." But those who passed were transformed. Ordinary women became something extraordinary, messengers of resistance, saboteurs, spies. In diaries and letters, fragments of their inner voices survive. One trainee wrote, "I have never felt so alive. Fear is constant, but so is purpose." Another confessed, "Every night I dream of my children, and every morning I wake ready to fight for their future." These words, scrawled in pencil under blackout lamps, revealed the human cost of choosing this hidden war. When their training ended, each woman was given a new name, forged documents, and a mission. Some received cyanide pills sewn into their clothing, a grim reminder of what awaited if captured. On dark nights, they boarded RAF aircraft bound for France, their parachutes strapped tight, their hearts pounding as the red light above the hatch flickered to green. They leapt into blackness, leaving behind not just the fields of Scotland but the lives they once knew. From mothers to widows, from students to secretaries, these women had crossed an invisible threshold. They were no longer civilians, they were soldiers of shadows. Their journey from ordinary life to extraordinary sacrifice set the stage for the perilous missions that awaited them on the other side of occupied Europe. The streets of occupied Paris hummed with uneasy life. Cafes on the Boulevard Saint-Germain were filled with German officers sipping coffee, their uniforms pressed, pistols resting at their sides. Factories churned day and night, producing spare parts for panzer divisions bound for the Eastern Front. Hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers ferried back from Stalingrad, their moans echoing down dim corridors. This was the world into which women of the resistance were dropped, their every step shadowed by danger. They wore disguises as easily as others wore coats. By day, one might appear as a nurse tending patients, her hands steady as she changed bandages. By night, the same woman crouched over a wireless set in a cramped attic, tapping out coded bursts of Morse code to London. A secretary could carry forged documents hidden inside a ledger, while a farm wife delivered messages tucked into baskets of eggs. Their ordinariness was their camouflage. Virginia Hall was among the most remarkable. An American working for the SOE, she had lost her left leg years before and walked with a heavy wooden prosthesis she nicknamed Cuthbert. To the Gestapo, she became infamous as the Limping Lady, a figure they hunted with ruthless determination. Yet she outpaced them, crisscrossing France on foot, leaning on a cane but never faltering. She coordinated parachute drops of weapons to Maquis fighters, organized sabotage of railway lines, and slipped through checkpoints with forged papers so convincing even seasoned Gestapo men were fooled. The risk was relentless. Radio transmissions were the lifeline of resistance networks, but they were also the noose. German detection vans roamed city streets, triangulating signals. Agents were trained never to transmit longer than 20 minutes, but even that was sometimes too long. One operator remembered the dread as static filled her headphones. The knowledge that somewhere, men in black vans were narrowing in on her location. She packed her set in seconds, fled across rooftops, and left behind only silence. Not every disguise was perfect, not every mission successful. Factories bristled with suspicion. Workers who lingered too long near machines risked denunciation. A whispered word at a cafe, overheard by the wrong ears, could unravel months of careful deception. Spies learned to talk with their eyes, to pass entire sentences with a flick of a glance or the placement of a cigarette on a table. Messages were hidden in laundry, in loaves of bread, in the margins of books carried under an arm. Dialogue in this hidden war was sparse, but sharp. A nurse at a checkpoint would answer curtly, "For the hospital," when asked about her bundle, her voice steady, though her palms sweated beneath her gloves. A German officer in a Paris cafe might lean forward, suspicion in his gaze, only to be disarmed by the agent's calm reply, "My husband is at the front. I wait for his letters." Lies became shields, spoken with conviction as though they were truth. Beyond Paris, networks stretched into Belgium, the Netherlands, and deep into Poland. Women ferried intelligence on troop convoys, ammunition depots, and airfields. They mapped railway junctions with meticulous detail, sketching bridges and tunnels in the margins of notebooks. Each scrap of information traveled back to London through invisible channels, helping Allied planners prepare bombing raids and anticipate German offensives. The Gestapo was relentless in response. Posters plastered across walls offered rewards for information. Their black and white photographs warning civilians that harboring spies meant death. Raids swept through neighborhoods at night, boots pounding on staircases, doors splintered open. Entire families were deported when one member was suspected of aiding the underground. The cost of deception was not borne by agents alone, but by the communities that shielded them. And yet, courage endured. Virginia Hall once hiked through the Pyrenees in winter, dragging her wooden leg across icy slopes to escape capture. Noor Inayat Khan transmitted from Paris for months, shifting locations constantly, knowing her code name Madeleine was high on the Gestapo's list. Each day of survival was a victory. Each message sent was a spark of defiance, but survival could not last forever. Betrayals grew more common. Double agents infiltrated networks, and the Gestapo's grip tightened. For many of these women, the razor-thin line between freedom and capture grew thinner with every passing day. The chapter closes in shadow. Agents still moving through cafes and factories, still whispering lies that saved lives, yet living under the knowledge that discovery meant unimaginable suffering. The machinery of Nazi prisons was waiting, and for some, the next knock at the door would end the masquerade. The Gestapo rarely moved clumsily. Their strikes were calculated, built on months of surveillance, infiltration, and betrayal. Networks that had once pulsed with coded messages and quiet victories suddenly fell silent. Double agents, coerced by threats or lured by rewards, exposed names and meeting places. In Paris, detection vans tracked radio transmissions to their source. In Lyon, a single whisper under interrogation unraveled entire webs of resistance. For many of the women who had risked everything behind enemy lines, the knock came at night. Boots on stairs. The crack of a door forced open. Arrest was not the end of the mission. It was the beginning of another kind of war. Stripped of weapons, stripped of disguises, they faced the raw machinery of Nazi interrogation. In cold rooms with bare walls, their bodies became the battlegrounds. Odette Sansom, captured in 1943, endured a crucifixion of pain. Her toenails were torn out, her back seared with hot irons, her bones broken. The Gestapo demanded names, demanded codes, demanded addresses. She gave them nothing. "You will learn nothing from me," she told her captors, her voice fractured but unyielding. The statement was simple, defiant, and absolute. Noor Inayat Khan suffered the same crucible. After months of defying capture as a wireless operator in Paris, she was betrayed, shackled, and dragged to Gestapo headquarters. For weeks, she was beaten, starved, and chained like an animal. Her interrogators raged at her silence. Still, she refused to betray her comrades. She attempted escape twice, scaling rooftops and dashing into the Paris night, only to be recaptured. German reports describe her as highly dangerous and uncooperative. It was the highest praise the Gestapo could give. These women could not appeal to the Geneva Convention. Spies and saboteurs were classified outside its protections. Unlike uniformed prisoners of war, they were considered unlawful combatants, stripped of rights, condemned as criminals rather than soldiers. Torture was not an aberration, it was the method. And yet silence became their final weapon. Every withheld name, every unbroken code, bought time for others to flee, regroup, and fight on. In France prison near Paris, in Ravensbrück concentration camp, and in the dungeons of Gestapo headquarters across Europe, Sikin Citoyennetin s'étonnent. Female agents resisted with the only tools left to them: dignity and endurance. Prisoners later recalled Odette whispering encouragement in the darkness of her cell, her voice carrying strength through cracked walls. Others remembered Noor's haunting songs, fragments of Indian melodies carried through the corridors, lifting spirits in the bleakest hours. Dialogue between captor and captive was often brief, but seared into memory. A Gestapo officer once sneered at Odette, "You will talk in the end." Her reply was quiet, steady, "I will not." These exchanges were not mere defiance, they were declarations of victory over fear. The brutality was matched by uncertainty. Prisoners never knew if dawn would bring another interrogation, another execution, or another train to an unknown camp. Yet within this abyss, the women forged invisible bonds with their fellow captives. Acts of defiance were shared silently. A smuggled scrap of bread, a whispered prayer, a glance that said, "Hold fast." Their courage became contagious, spreading beyond themselves, sustaining others in the shadow of death. For some, the ordeal ended at the execution ground. Noor Inayat Khan was transported to Dachau in September 1944. Witnesses recalled her final word before the gunshot, "Liberté," freedom. In that single cry, she embodied the struggle of millions who could not speak. The cruelty of their captors sought to erase them, but it only magnified their defiance. The Gestapo files, intended to record their destruction, now stand as testament to their unbroken will. And for those who survived, the scars, both visible and unseen, bore witness long after the guns of Europe fell silent. Their capture was not a failure. It was a turning point, a demonstration that resistance was measured not only in missions accomplished, but in secrets kept under unbearable pressure. In their silence, they safeguarded entire networks. In their endurance, they inspired those who lived. The war would end, but their crucible of suffering left an echo that could not be silenced. As the darkness of captivity deepened, executions loomed. Yet even then, their refusal to yield carried a weight far beyond prison walls. For across occupied Europe, whispers of their courage spread, lighting sparks of resistance in those still free. War was not fought only in the shadows of safe houses or the cells of Gestapo prisons. Across Europe and across the Channel in Britain, women carried the war effort in quieter ways, acts that seemed ordinary but were, in truth, decisive. Their courage did not always require pistols or parachutes. It was measured in the clang of factory machines, in the secret exchange of forged documents, and in the quiet refusal to bow to occupation. In Britain, as men left for the front, women filled their places in munitions plants and aircraft factories. They assembled Spitfire fuselages, riveted Lancaster bombers, and worked 12-hour shifts at machines that pressed millions of rounds of ammunition. By 1943, women made up more than half of Britain's industrial workforce. Their hands, blistered and stained with grease, fed the arsenals that would storm Normandy. Yet their contribution did not end at production lines. In many factories, small acts of sabotage crept in. A batch of cartridges deliberately weakened, a part subtly flawed, ensuring that weapons meant for the enemy failed when most needed. On the continent, resistance was woven into daily life. In Belgium and Poland, women became couriers, moving between towns with papers hidden in aprons or loaves of bread. They carried forged identity cards to Jewish families, ration coupons to starving neighbors, and coded messages slipped between the pages of hymn books. Each delivery was a gamble. At every checkpoint, they risked discovery. When asked where she was traveling, one courier answered evenly, "To visit my aunt," though her bag concealed intelligence that would guide Allied bombers to a railway junction. The lie was small, but its impact vast. Fields and farmhouses became sanctuaries. In Normandy, Dutch barns, and the rolling countryside of Belgium, women concealed Allied pilots shot down over Europe. They dressed wounds by candlelight, disguised airmen in workers' clothes, and taught them local phrases to survive until escape networks could return them to England. Farmers' wives served coffee to German patrols in the kitchen, while Allied fugitives hid in the hayloft above. Every knock at the door sent fear rushing through their veins, yet their faces betrayed nothing. The Red Cross, too, became a lifeline. Female nurses smuggled medical supplies beneath bandages, slipped letters from prisoner-of-war camps to families outside, and, in some cases, aided daring escapes. On hospital trains, a quiet handoff of papers or a whispered warning could save a soldier from deportation to a labor camp. Their uniforms gave them access, but also made them visible targets. Still, they carried on, bound by duty stronger than fear. These efforts blurred the line between civilian and combatant. A mother who baked bread for her family by day could, by night, be forging ration cards for a resistance cell. A girl cycling to school might be carrying coded messages rolled tightly inside the handlebars of her bicycle. Resistance did not always look like battle. It often looked like survival weaponized against tyranny. Amidst the constant danger, there were moments of sharp humanity. A factory worker in Coventry wrote to her sister, "Every shell I rivet, I think of father in uniform. I do this for him." A Polish courier, when asked why she risked her life daily, replied, "Because my country breathes through us. If we stop, it dies." These voices remind us that courage was not abstract. It lived in the choices of ordinary women who refused to be broken. As 1944 approached, their quiet labor laid the foundation for the great turning point of the war. Intelligence ferried by female couriers guided Allied bombing raids. Sabotaged ammunition slowed German divisions. Hidden pilots rejoined the fight in England. Every act, invisible at the time, created ripples that spread across battlefields. When the Allies prepared for D-Day, they did so with maps drawn from information carried in school satchels, with armies supplied by weapons women had built, and with soldiers strengthened by food and medicine women had smuggled past the Gestapo. The tide of war was shifting, and though their names were rarely spoken, the unseen hands of women had helped turn it. The thunder of Allied tanks echoed through Paris in August 1944. Crowds surged into the streets, waving tricolor flags torn from hiding, their voices rising in songs long forbidden. Women who had carried lies and secrets through years of occupation stood in the celebration, their faces wet with tears, their bodies trembling with relief. Yet, for many of them, liberation brought not triumph, but silence. Some agents returned home alive, but bound by oaths of secrecy. Britain's Official Secrets Act prevented operatives from telling their stories. Families asked questions, but answers never came. Daughters were told their mothers had worked in offices, never knowing the missions that had nearly cost them their lives. For others, silence was not imposed by governments, but by trauma. The memories of torture chambers, of executions witnessed, of comrades who never came back. These burdens were carried quietly, hidden behind ordinary lives rebuilt in peacetime. Many never returned at all. Noor Inayat Khan, executed at Dachau in 1944, left no grave. For years, her name lived only in whispers within the resistance, her courage remembered by those who had heard her final word, "Liberté," before the bullet struck. Others, like Violette Sabo, captured and killed in Ravensbrück, were honored posthumously, their faces framed in photographs on mantles of families who had only their memory left. Recognition came slowly. Medals were awarded, but often years too late, overshadowed by the grand narratives of generals and armies. Odette Sansom, who had endured torture and survived Ravensbrück, became one of the few women to receive the George Cross, Britain's highest civilian award for bravery. When she accepted, her words were not of pride, but of remembrance. The real heroes are the ones who did not return. Across Europe, statues and plaques eventually appeared, their inscriptions brief, their presence modest. In Warsaw, monuments honored resistance couriers who fell during the uprising. In France, memorials bore the names of women executed at Ravensbrück. But in countless villages, the contributions of factory workers, nurses, and couriers remained unspoken, their sacrifices folded into the anonymous fabric of survival. The silence was not only in public memory, but in private homes. Survivors who had been couriers or factory workers often spoke little of their wartime choices. One woman, decades later, told her granddaughter simply, "We did what we had to do, and then we tried to forget." Forgetting, however, was impossible. Nightmares persisted. The sound of boots on pavement, the glare of searchlights, the memory of whispered lies at checkpoints, they lingered long after the war ended. For some, silence became a shield. For others, it was a prison. But whether spoken or unspoken, the cost of courage was immense. Each coded message, each forged paper, each life saved carried with it a weight measured not only in risk, but in lasting scars. As the war moved into memory, the question of recognition grew sharper. Whose names would be remembered in history books? Whose stories would fade? The narrative of victory often centered on battles won and treaties signed. Yet in the shadows of those grand accounts lay the stories of women who had fought with deception and resilience, their victories invisible but indispensable. Liberation had come, but it was layered with sorrow. The cities were free, but the cemeteries filled. Families reunited, but with empty chairs at their tables. For the women who survived, the return to ordinary life was perhaps the hardest mission of all, because ordinary life could never again be truly ordinary. Their silence was not weakness. It was the final echo of their service, an act of endurance that stretched beyond war into peace. And within that silence, history carried both its triumph and its grief. The war ended, but its echoes never fully faded. In the decades that followed, the deeds of these women, once hidden beneath layers of secrecy, slowly emerged into light. Files once stamped classified were declassified, revealing the scale of their contributions. Reports from MI6, the OSS, and the SOE named women who had carried false papers, operated radios under the threat of death, and endured the full weight of Gestapo cruelty without breaking. Their courage, once invisible, became recognized as the foundation of modern intelligence work. Today, their legacy stands in bronze, stone, and ceremony. In London, a memorial at Lambeth honors the agents of the SOE, many of them women. In Paris, plaques mark the spots where couriers were arrested, reminding passers-by that freedom was purchased with silence and sacrifice. In the United States, the CIA openly acknowledges that the shadow war of women like Virginia Hall laid the blueprint for intelligence operations that endure to this day. Yet, their greatest memorial is not found in statues or medals, but in the lessons they left behind. They proved that war is not only fought with tanks, artillery, and squadrons of bombers. It is fought in the unseen realm, through deception, quiet resistance, and the unshakable courage to risk everything for a chance at freedom. They showed the world that strength could wear many faces. The nurse, tending the wounded, the factory worker at her station, the courier balancing a basket of bread, the spy transmitting in the night. Even now, their names are not all known. Many were executed without record, their stories buried in mass graves or lost to time. But history, once reluctant to acknowledge them, is learning to restore their place. Schools teach their stories. Museums preserve their photographs. Their faces return from obscurity. Their voices carried into a new century. As the shadows of war recede into memory, the silence they carried becomes our responsibility to break. Every coded message, every forged document, every act of defiance carried a human cost. To remember them is not only to honor their sacrifice, but to recognize the endurance of human spirit against tyranny. And so, we return one last time to Lyon. The year is 1944. A woman in a plain trench coat walks into the darkness, a basket of bread in her hands, her footsteps fading into the night. The Gestapo checkpoint lies behind her, the danger not yet gone, her mission still unfinished. Her name is unknown, her fate unwritten, but in her silence and her courage, she represents them all. The countless women whose shadows carried the weight of freedom, whose secrets helped to shatter the Nazi grip on Europe.